and I run diversity and inclusion for Bank of America globally. I'm also responsible for talent acquisition. I have some of my partners in the audience. We've actually hired over 60,000 people this year alone. So we've been incredibly busy, and we're not at the end of the year. But today's topic is all about social responsibility. It's all about economic opportunity. And I have the pleasure of moderating a session with two powerhouse leaders, Ms. Ebony Thomas and Mr. Steve Boland. So with that, I'm going to join them on stage and get us started. But one of the things I wanted to say before I introduce these two, in the last session, Tiffany Eubanks Saunders talked about Ms. Ebony Thomas, who leads our foundation. She is the first Black person to lead it at Bank of America. So let's give her a round of applause. And I looked up some statistics. If you think about leaders who sit at the management team level, it's about 8% are Black. Mr. Boland is in that 8%, as he sits at the C-suite at Bank of America. So let's give him a round of applause. And so today's topic is one around social responsibility. It's about economic opportunity. It's work that we've been doing well before George Floyd's murder at Bank of America. And it's a long-standing commitment. And today we want to explore the why, the role of corporate America, the role, quite frankly, of each one of us as a citizen in this country, around what we need to do and continue to do to really drive a more equitable opportunity for everyone. So with that, I'm going to ask Steve and Ebony first to introduce themselves. I have their bios, but it's going to be nicer coming from them. So let's start with Ebony.
So I need to bring Tiffany back, because I mean, that's just like the best intro ever. But no, Ebony Thomas, I'm the president of the Bank of America Charitable Foundation. Also lead our work around racial equality and economic opportunity, which we'll dive a little bit deeper into. I was talking to some of our members in the audience who are teammates, and I was asking, like, how many years have you been here? 12, 16? I'm like, dang, I'm still not there yet. So I'm almost 10 years in. I sit in Charlotte. As Tiffany also alluded to, I'm a North Carolina A&T graduate, so an HBCU graduate, and just excited to be here and share more about our journey and story.
So, Steve Boland, I'm the Chief Administrative Officer for Bank of America, and unlike Ebony, I'm well past the 10. Waved at 20 as I went on by. I've been with Bank of America and predecessor companies for the better part of the last 32 years. I started straight out of school, management training program, and grew up mostly in consumer and in wealth management. And until last year, I was running the retail bank for Bank of America, and now Chief Administrative Officer is basically a lot of the administrative functions that help the bank run. So everything from global corporate security to corporate communications and media relations, all of our local markets organization, global public policy, ESG, foundation, a lot of stuff in there. But that's me.
So can you hear me okay? No? All right. We only have two mics up here. So I want to start with just the basics, the foundation. When you think about the importance of this work, particularly now, when you think about, the fact that a lot of corporates, SEC filings, proxy statements, shareholder conversations, annual reports, I saw a study that talked about the number of times that companies are now reflecting on things like economic opportunity, social responsibility, diversity, equity, inclusion. Can you talk about the history of this work, but why it is so important at this particular time?
I mean, you said it earlier in that we have been doing this work well before George Floyd. So I really just want to ground everyone a little bit in our structure and how we deliver for our clients, our teammates, and our customers. So the hallmark of our strategy is our 93 markets. So across the US, we have 93 markets, and within those markets, there are presidents that sit in those markets that really make decisions around what is best for that particular community. to steal a word from Ryan Stevenson, they are proximate to the people, to the challenges, to the plight of that community. So it's important that we invest in those markets, and those individual presidents, that team within that market, is really allowed to make sure what's best for Memphis is going to be different than what's best for Charlotte, and what's best for Seattle is going to be different from Dallas. And so we have an overarching strategy that we think about, but how it's actually deployed is very local. And that makes the difference, because it makes it feel like that the people in that community understand the mission, our responsible growth strategy, directly in that particular market. So it's very tangible, the impact and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So now you fast forward, and it's 2020, we are in the midst of a number of crises. We're watching on television as the killing of George Floyd comes to light. We're also in the midst of what I like to call a stress test that none of us decided to be a part of, which is, COVID-19 and the pandemic. And so those two things converge, and it's really incumbent upon an organization to respond in the most appropriate way. And our response is not just about those two things, it's really about how do we meet the needs, again, of our employees, our customers, our clients, and our community. And so the commitment that we made was really to accelerate how we invest in those communities, and doing it in a very strategic and thoughtful way, very much on brand in terms of who we are. So those 4 areas that we focus on and around this work are on health, small business resiliency, housing, and jobs. And when you think about health, it's really the linchpin to allow all those other things to happen. You need that work. You need it for health, for housing, for small business, and for jobs. And so it's the culmination of that, of how we deliver the work for our communities, again, our customers and our clients.
So Steve, I want to build up on that a little bit. Ebony talked about sort of the work that the Bank of America has been doing, the need to double down. You've been on all these shareholder calls, engaging in dialogue on topics around social equity, economic opportunity, and also in your previous role have done a lot of work around how we drive responsible growth from a social perspective for our own clients. Can you talk a little bit about the dialogue that you're having at your level on these critical topics and some of the things that the bank has done to respond?
Yeah, sure. So, Ebony characterized it well, because sometimes we want to put this work in a special bucket. It's not. At Bank of America, we run the company under a framework we call responsible growth. The first tenet of that framework is we must grow, no excuses. So what does that mean when we're talking to our shareholders? When I ran the retail bank and you're talking to them about loan growth, or you're talking to them about deposit growth, or you're talking to them about expense controls and management, they're expecting you to achieve that, no excuses. Well, it's the same thing. We expect that when you think about our workforce and the fact that we need to have diverse representation at every level across our company that reflects the communities that we serve, we must do that, no excuses. When we talk about how do we help make the financial lives of our clients better, well, you do that when you eliminate NSF fees. You do that when you have the lowest OD fees in the industry. You do that when you have products and services that meet the needs of our clients, like low down payment mortgages with down payment grants for closing costs and down payment assistance that enable people to achieve home ownership, which leads to wealth creation. We have to do that, and we have to do that, no excuses. Everything that we think about when we think about this work is just about responsible growth. It's about how we do it. We're client-driven, how we do it inside of our risk framework. That's really important, by the way. Anybody that thinks that we do a bunch of these programs and work, and it's like no shade at philanthropy, because we do a lot of great work with philanthropy. That's fine, but actually doing the loans is not philanthropy. Doing the loans is good business. We have a community homeownership commitment that is $15 billion to create 60,000 new homeowners over a period of 5 years. We offer loan down payment loans and down payment closing cost grants, and we have 0 losses in that program. We started that program pre-pandemic, so we've been through some stress, right? So this is all thinking about what do our clients need, developing the kinds of products and services they need, delivering that to those clients, and that's what the conversation is with shareholders. So I get on the phone with shareholders, and it's interesting, because I used to go into analyst calls, and they were asking me a lot about spreads and margins and revenue and things like that. When you talk to the people who are the owners of our stock, they're asking me every day about, well, what are you doing about lowering greenhouse gas emissions? We want to understand. I had a call yesterday where someone said, we want to understand there's something called the TCFD framework around, if you guys are really into the environment, we can, go there, right? But it's like, tell me how you're going to achieve your net zero ambitions. How are you going to lower greenhouse gas emissions? How are you going to activate your bankers in the investment bank and the commercial bank to assist clients with the just transition? Because that's what it is. We finance people to change and modify their way of doing business so that they can transition to lower emitting ways to do business, right? And so across the spectrum, I always just anchor back to responsible growth as being the way that we drive it. And I go with the tenets that were laid out by our CEO, Brian Moynihan. We're going to do it, no excuses. We're going to do it within our client-driven strategy, so we're driving this through with our clients. We're going to do it within our risk framework. We don't do anything that we don't think that would fit our risk appetite. And we're going to do things that are sustainable. That's the point that Cynthia made. We didn't just start this work. This is the way that we run the company. Yes, in the wake of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, we made a very specific commitment, well over $1 billion, which, by the way, we're halfway through 600 million, which means we got a long ways to go. And I always love, I get to come up and talk about the work, just to be clear. Ebony Thomas, Kimberly Harris is out here. They're the ones who actually did the work. I just get to go talk about it and brag on them. But you should give these guys a round of applause because they are the architects.
So one follow-up question for you, and then I'm going to go back to Ebony to talk about this 1.25. You talk about OD, overdraft fees, and in the spirit of responsible growth, every dollar is not a good dollar. And I remember an interview with Brian where they said, well, how are you going to make up that revenue? And his answer was, we're not. Can you talk a little bit about that work, why it was important? I know you were fairly instrumental in driving that forward.
Yeah, what was interesting about this, because this journey started, I love my successor, Holly O'Neill, who runs the retail bank, but we did start this work a few years back. No, but the interesting thing in the conversation with Brian, it was not even about how are you going to make up the revenue. If you were here today, he'd tell you the only problem with what we did is we were too slow. He wanted us to go faster. Think about that for just a second, just so you can this was billions of dollars in revenue at one point if you go back a decade plus. Somebody who says, how can you eliminate billions of dollars of revenue faster? I mean, that's the context. And what he constantly told us was, first of all, we're going to deliver the solutions that help people make their financial lives better. So we didn't just eliminate OD fees, because that doesn't actually help anybody. What we started with was in 2014 when we launched a program called Safe Balance, where we had a loan, a deposit account, a checking account, where you didn't have OD fees. Then we had overdraft protection that said, by the way, if you say you want to be able to have the ability to potentially, not keep everything reconciled, you can connect your account to a savings account. Well, we just kept going, and we said, okay, we went on down the road, and we found out that a lot of people were in this, what we call low balance, very small amounts, that they weren't not managing their account, and in fact, what the problem was, they just didn't have enough to get from paycheck to paycheck, and they were either overdrafting and living off of that, or they were going outside of our system to payday lenders. So we created something called Balance Assist. up to $500 for a flat $5 fee that they could borrow for 3 months. What we found out was a bunch of people fell out of overdraft because now we gave them a solution, a very affordable, reasonable, transparent, fair solution to how to make their financial life better and meet their needs. And then we advanced overdraft protection to expand where you could attach it to up to 5 accounts. So if you forgot, you set it up years ago, and that account now no longer had money in it, it would just roll to the next account. Now we gave you a bunch of solutions that helped you manage your financial lives, and we said, now what can we do? We can move away from overdraft entirely. Sustainable, client-driven, and something we must do. You have to be relentless.
So talking about sustainable and client-driven, Ebony, first of all, Kimberlyn is in the room, she's taking a sip of her coffee, but 2 Black women running a $1.25 billion program. Let's just give them a round of applause. sustainable, measurable, impact. Can you just share a sampling of what you've been able to do in our own communities through this work and the impact that you, with the bank support, have been able to make?
You know, I go back to something Steve said when he was like, no shade, and he's absolutely right, because the way that I think about philanthropy, it's a tool that we use to sometimes wrap around those things that we want to do to help the community move forward. And so when I think about the work that we've done collectively, you, Steve, everyone, all of the teammates in the audience, because we have done it collectively, is really think about what's the best way to be able to do it. And I talk about it in two ways of the work. We do it around being catalytic, or we catalyze things, and we build ecosystems. And so, you know, part of the 1.25 or the racial equality work itself is really focused on how do we help distribute capital to communities, to individuals, to organizations, based on a theory of change that we have or we've established with them to say, this is what we want to achieve and to have an end goal. What is the outcome that we want to have? And so we measure that. So Kimlin, our team, are really focused on what is the starting place, and then what are the steps that we're taking to actually measure that outcome or impact, which is, I will tell you, not easy to do. As you all know, or some know, that the E is well established. It's been around for quite some time. People understand it more. The S, a little bit more work has to be done to build out that framework to make sure that we're doing it in a way that, number one, people can understand and can relate to what you're trying to achieve. And so when I think about catalyzing work, it's the work that we do around jobs, for example. It's the notion that you're a college student or you're aspiring to be a college student, you enter an institution, whether it be a community college, a historically black college or university, a Hispanic serving institution, or just a general institution, and you don't know what you want to do. You just know that you want to go to school. And so our theory is, how do we help students get on the pathway to a job that is high paying, that we know will be there in the future? Because as Tiffany talked about in the previous session, is that those high income jobs create or can be a catalyst for net wealth creation. And so it's the thought of bringing the student, the community college or institution, along with companies to sit at the same table to really have a discussion about how do we get the student into the right place. I mean, that's transformative. Bernard used that word. And that's the work that we're trying to do. We don't do it alone. We need other companies to be a part of it. We need other institutions to be a part of it. But it's really to say, how do we fund the initiation of that so we can get the work started? When we think about ecosystems, I use our $400 million that we've deployed in our equity investments. We're taking diverse fund managers from all walks of life, and it's interesting to know that of our fund managers, over 50% of them are women, and the vast majority of those diverse fund managers are African American and Latino women. And so these are individuals who are driving business, creating business. And so the investment into these fund managers that then are invested into these portfolio companies that then do what? They hire people, they create jobs, they pump that money back into the economy and back into their community. And so that's really about catalyzing or creating an ecosystem that can be sustainable, not just for 22 through 2025, but it's a lasting impact that we're trying to create here. So it's really being thoughtful about the long-term impact that we're trying to have, sometimes the short-term, because sometimes short-term immediate things are needed. And so it's a look at both of those things, and we're measuring all of that work along the way. And so it is exciting to say the least. I can talk about it forever. But it's just really good work. And you know, when we have a conversation with some of our portfolio managers and they talk about the individuals that they've had an opportunity to invest in, I mean, the stories are phenomenal. And oftentimes we think of this young person in a hoodie and, you know, going to ask for money. These individuals look like me, they look like Steve, they look like a lot of you in the audience. They've had a vision and a dream. They've been over-mentored for a number of years, and now someone is deploying capital for them to actually execute on that vision and that mentorship that they've had. So it's pretty exciting to be able to catalyze the work and then also create ecosystems.
So I have about two other questions. I mean, I can keep talking them, but we do have a mic. So I'm gonna ask you to start thinking about your questions. Feel free to come up to the mic to engage with both Ebony and Steve. But this is ELC, and ELC has some real talk, real conversation. So let's talk about the impact of the Black community specifically. I could talk about the internal or the DEI challenges, and one of the things I would encourage anyone to do is read our annual report. There's a human capital management section that talks specifically about what we've been doing to change the face of Black leadership at the bank at all levels. We already look like the world we live in. That's table stakes, right? Your company should look like the world you live in collectively. We do that. But we've been closing the gap at the top. We have 2 members on our board, our lead independent directors, Black, 2 members sit on the MTM, including Steve. We will share our statistics, 3D from the CEO, managers, and all of our EO. We've been doing that for years. That should be an expectation of corporations because it creates accountability to drive the change that's needed. So let's talk about the change that's still needed from a social, racial equity, economic opportunity perspective in the Black community. What are some of the things that you all have been helping to drive specifically, to impact the work that we do as well, specifically around Black consumers and clients?
Wow, there's so many, and I know Steve will go deep into that. From the work that we do, I'll talk about one in particular because it's one that I think we have not talked as broadly about, but the lasting impact can be phenomenal. So oftentimes organizations will receive tons of feedback around many of the historically Black colleges that they work for or work with. Is usually what people think about are the usual suspects, right? The larger institutions, the Howards, the Spelmans, the Morehouses, the A&Ts of the world, and they are important. And I think in this conversation around the Black community, we can't think about which ones are better or not. It's really, when one is successful, everyone is successful. So we have to really start thinking about it in the context of not necessarily competition, but how do we ensure that the sustainability and the fact that they will be there for another 200 years is so important. So we've been working on a strategy called the Way Forward. And this one in particular is about private HBCUs. As you know, or if you don't know, private historically Black colleges have a different type of challenge. They are primarily dependent upon enrollment. And when you're primarily dependent upon enrollment and that drops, so then does the needs that you have on a particular campus. And so we've been working with an organization and we have 2 cohorts of private HBCUs, very small HBCUs. We're talking about enrollment under 2,000. To make sure that they are here for another 200 years. They are critical to that community. And we can pull stats and so many other things, but I saw this morning, for example, in Charlotte, that the Duke Mayo Classic that came to Charlotte, which was between North Carolina A&T and Central, brought $50 million of revenue to the city. So we recognize and understand the criticality of HBCUs and the economic power that they have within communities, and so do these small institutions. They are critical economic beds to these communities in which they live in. So it's important for Bank of America to ensure that they not only survive, but they thrive. And so making sure that they are thinking about enrollment services, student success services, financial management, looking at their boards to ensure that they have the right level of board participation. And so this is some of the work that is the roll up your sleeves work. It's not necessarily the flashy, the headline, but it's the work that gets in deep that makes an impact and ultimately directly impacts the Black community, not only within that particular city or market, but definitely peripheral across a particular state.
Just to add on a couple things to that. The one is, it stays with this kind of education theme that also leads to workforce development and building up kind of that workforce and pool of talent of the future. So in addition to the work we're doing with HBCUs and HSIs, we're also doing a lot of work with community colleges. I was in New England last week and met with the head of one of the largest community college systems. It's actually in Rhode Island, for those of you who don't know. I didn't know that earlier. And she was really proud of their results for a couple of reasons. If you don't know this, by the way, so community colleges, extremely high representation from our community. So Black and brown students, HBCUs, HSIs are important. Community colleges are important for us to get really at a large swath of population. The stat across community college systems is, as a result of the pandemic, no different than what's happened in grade schools and high schools. A bunch of us have just dropped out of the system, right? And we could talk another time about what that really means for society when you've got kids dropping out of 4th grade and 6th grade and they're falling out of our school system. But right now, when you think about the problem in community colleges, she was really proud because she stood out where everybody else's enrollment's down kind of double digits. For Black and brown students, she's up 4%. And she's been intentional about that, and by the way, and she's partnering with us, right? Because we're making sure that those students are getting jobs. We're making sure that those schools are getting enrolled in programs so we can develop them for solutions. A secondary piece that I would just raise, I was here yesterday in DC, not at the conference, and I was up at Treasury because we were announcing work that we're doing to invest in minority deposit institutions and community development financial institutions, MDIs and CDFIs. So we have the largest CDFI portfolio in the country at around $2 billion. A colleague of ours, Dan Latendra, manages it, does a phenomenal job. We also keep about $100 million in deposits at MDIs. Why is that important? Bread and butter banking. We gather deposits, we make loans. If you don't get deposits, you can't make more loans. And so the fact that we enable loan portfolios is great. The fact that we have $42.5 million invested in 22 MDIs and CDFIs is great, but they actually need deposits, billions of them, to be able to get in there. So we've held $100 million. Yesterday we announced we're doubling that. We're gonna add $100 million more, low-cost deposits at CDFIs and MDIs. Not only does that help them be able to lend more in our communities, but I'm hoping, candidly, that we encourage, cajole, maybe shame, we get our competitors to do the same. Because our $100 million is great, but I need a lot of those. And I need everybody to say, it's important for us to add deposits at CDFIs and MDIs so they can do the great work they do, because they're just simply an extension of us in our communities. Extending loans to small business, extending loans for housing. And so that's really important. The last piece that I've just got to mention, because Ebony and Kimberlyn are really on the precipice of something that's game-changing, and I'll be retired, they might even be as young as they are by the time we really see the benefits and impact of it. But this is really huge in health equity. So they started a program that's with, she'll clean me up if I say it wrong, but American Cancer, American Diabetes, American Heart, and the University of Michigan School of Public Health. All right, so they did a partnership, we seeded it with $25 million, and it's focused on health equity. If we all don't understand that health equity is huge for our community, we haven't been paying attention to the stats over the last 2 years. Okay? We got infected, again, clean me up where I get it wrong, we got infected 2 to 3 times higher during the pandemic with COVID. We died 6 times higher. This is an existential threat. By the way, that wasn't unique, we just highlighted that. So if you think about the organizations that I just talked about, the prevalence of issues of diabetes, incidences of diabetes, cancer, heart disease are much higher in our communities than not. We have to solve this issue. And it's going to take capital, and it's going to take collaboration. The thing that, if you don't know a lot about health and health issues, the ability to actually get those 3 folks to the table to work together, American Heart, Diabetes, and Cancer, never been done. So it's game changing, and we're at the beginning of that. Those are the kinds of things that we're doing for our community.
All right, so let's open it up for some questions from the audience.
Good afternoon. Is this on? Well, hopefully you can hear me. I'm Millicent Ruffin. I'm with the Office of Racial Equality and Social Unity at Corning Incorporated. And so love everything that you all are doing. One question I have is, the data shows since George Floyd's murder, over $400 million have been, or actually billion, right, have been committed to this effort by corporations, but only about 4% of that is being directed towards public policy. And so when we think about sustainability and we think about the impact of these systemic barriers, what's the role corporations can play to have more impact on policy?
So, it's interesting because one of the things that we talked about in the last body of work that Steve talked about was policy. And one of the key elements of the work was understanding the public policy influence that those three organizations had collectively, right? American Heart, Cancer, Diabetes. And so, to Steve's point, pulling those organizations together to leverage the power of their influence in particular states and at the federal level. So it's important that, again, we do work through others. The other part of the work that we continue to do is empowering and educating our communities for them to be advocates themselves, to understand what the issues are and how do they use their voice within their community to ensure that they understand, number one, what issues are important to them and how to use their voice. We think about healthcare, for example. In many places, we talk about food deserts, there are health deserts, meaning within a 25, 30-mile radius, there's no primary care facility within that particular community. Now, we've done work to help fund to close some of those gaps in those communities, but it's also important to educate and let people know what's happening within their community so they can help be a voice and an advocate for themselves. So I think about how do we do it through the power of our network, and then giving people the education and information for them to have a voice within their communities.
And the only thing I'd add is I'm not sure the accounting is probably right on that. The reason I say that is there is a lot of work that's going on that you won't see lined up to an individual company's commitment, but that you'll see across. So we all leverage a lot of institutions and associations to try to drive policy outcomes. And a lot of times, by the way, that's really powerful because that's a collective, right? We're finding that in the environmental work. No one bank, lender, company is going to be able to influence it, but as an industry, we can actually have a powerful voice. And then we have other systems. So we've got a group called the National Community Advisory Council, and it's a group of advocacy organizations, by the way, that actually represent left, center, and right, because we think we need the surround sound of the entire voice to be able to get after these issues. It's actually incredibly powerful when I have a center-right organization that says that the mortgage program that you created to revitalize communities is a good one. That's candidly more powerful than when I have one of the left organizations that they do thought that way anyway. It's actually be getting somebody to speak up who you didn't realize that they said, wow, this is good for our communities too. And so I think that there's that work going on. That said, I think the underlying point that you raised is incredibly important. Everyone who's made a public commitment should be held to account to demonstrate and exhibit exactly where those dollars went that they committed to. Obviously, I'm very confident that if they'd like to do that, we will be happy to be at the front of the line, because we can.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. My name is Donna Fortenberry, Chief of Staff for Global DE&I at BP. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'm going to actually be a little bit more specific because I'm interested. But you talked about the community colleges. I definitely believe that really addressing some of the inequity in our community is dealing with the children much earlier than at the community college. But the problem that I see is you can't go into a school and give them laptops and talk education when they're hungry. So I guess, you touched on it a little bit when you talked about educating them on different things, but I would like to hear what grassroots efforts or what specific programs that you kind of put in place, and with those, what results have you seen thus far?
Probably give you more of the former than the latter, because a lot of these are long-term when you talk about the results. And so to be honest, you have to actually, remember I talked about the Bank of America way of thinking about it when we talk about responsible growth is sustainable. I'm okay if I don't have it this quarter or this year, but I can see where it's leading towards. So I'll give you some quick examples only because it's probably a longer conversation. You're right, we've got to make sure that we are thinking about how do we address the needs of the whole family. So, for instance, we've tested some things with going back to school systems prior to getting to kind of community colleges, where, like in Charlotte, where I happen to live, so the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system is one of the worst performing ones. We have to fix that, and we believe that as a corporate community, we should all care. Why? Because our kids go to these schools because we live in these communities, and if we don't care for our community, then we're going to have bad community outcomes. And so one of the things we're really advocating for is that ability to not own everything from how do we address food insecurity to how do we address healthcare, and there's a whole effort around how can you put in clinics that could be self-sustaining after a very initial seed money in states where the Medicaid laws, and it happens to not be yet in North Carolina, but I'm optimistic it will be next year. So you can get them in the school system, they'll be self-sustaining, they'll serve the entire family. For food insecurity, we're going through our second campaign where earlier this year, to encourage both our employee base to be able to get vaccinated and boosted, and now we're doing it to say, hey, to get boosted and to get your flu vaccine, everyone who gets a shot will donate $100 to a local food bank. And again, we can make that very local because the people who decide the food banks are all of my local markets leaders. So the president in Charlotte, the president in Memphis, the president in Greater DC decides where it goes. And we ended up giving $10.6 million earlier this year, with ranging from, what did we floor it at, 20 grand or something like that, I think, was the smallest. And some food banks that got $1 million. Well, we're doing it again right now this season for boosters and flu vaccines. I wouldn't be surprised if we end up somewhere around $10 million again. And then you leverage those food banks because they've got the infrastructure to deploy. And now, by the way, when you write a check, you can help influence a little bit about where things happen and where they go. So a couple of examples, but there's a lot of work ahead. The last thing is we have a program that we call Leader on Loan. We take employees of our company and we lend them to organizations addressing some of society's needs, so community colleges, nonprofit organizations, etc. And we'll donate them for a year, in some cases more. And they still get paid just as if they were a Bank of America, but they get the talent and skill sets they need to be able to help them address some of these issues as well. Two things, we got a line, so I'm going to ask you if you don't mind just being able to get all mine. I can't, so I don't skip them, but then I'd love to get your question as well.
My name is Alicia. I have a quick question for you from a different angle. I lead our African Heritage Business Resource Group with my company. And so I wanted to know at Bank of America how you engage in that space with your, I don't know if it's employee resource group or business resource group or affinity group. And then also, if you do engage them, how do you keep the colleagues motivated when they also have full-time roles as we're trying to be more impactful to the community?
So I'll take that one. We have 11 networks at the bank. One of them is called Black Professional Groups. We have over 233,000 memberships at this point, over 330 chapters across the globe. In addition to that, we have what we call Black Executive Leadership Council, which are a group of our most senior Black leaders across the company, over 300. We also have a Black Executive Advisory Council, who are the most senior, even more senior group. And so I will say that, and we as a leadership team meet with, we host a summit every year to keep our employees engaged. We host conversations with some of the most senior leaders to advocate for what we think is necessary at the company. We host Power of 10 circles where we're engaging and bringing that group of leaders up in the company and trying to connect with them on a personal level for mentoring. And I would also tell you that part of that Black professional group includes a large percentage of people who aren't Black. Like a double-digit number of people in our Black professional group are actually white. Because we think that's important. It drives advocacy, it drives intersectionality, and it helps to really show that we're all in this goal of creating equity for everyone together. And we use forums like Stronger Together, All For, Inclusion Unites Us All to say, yes, we have a responsibility of addressing some unique issues of underrepresented groups like the Black employees at our company, but we need to do that collectively with everyone because we each have a role and a responsibility for driving equity and inclusion for all. And that's just not the responsibility of our Black employees at the company. So we engage them in all kind of ways. I mean, honestly, they also serve as an advisory board. So when Ebony was thinking through the work that they were doing, she goes to them periodically for updates. And she does the same thing with the Asian Advisory Council, and the Hispanic Latino Advisory Council, the LGBT Council, et cetera, because we have those same structures across other groups. I would also tell you that they have served as a voice, maybe not always to do as they say, but to listen and help define our approach around advocacy for voting, or when we decided, you know, certain positions to take on very political issues, we use that group to help us to understand and to think through and influence leadership around a path forward. So I hope that answers your question, but they are incredibly active. The last thing I will say is employees that are in our networks, their engagement scores are significantly higher than the average. So that means willing to stay, that means willing to go above and beyond, that means willing to engage around work differently. It's a competitive advantage, which is why we put a lot of investment in our networks across the company.
So let me add just one more thing. And because I think I heard underlying in your question was, how do you motivate people to do this work? Because I'm tired, right? I'm working pretty hard. Let's keep it real. I got a family, maybe, you know, I've got 3 adult children now, but I raised 3 children in that better part of 32 years of trying to move up through this company. That's, you know, you're trying to figure out where does the energy reserve come from. So here's what I say to encourage people around that, because there's no great answer to that. You're going to do more. The benefits of doing more is that very oftentimes the leadership that you can show through an ERG can translate into career growth that candidly even your day job doesn't translate to. So a decade ago, a handful of senior black leaders at Bank of America realized that we woke up and all of a sudden we looked up and now a lot of the senior people that we knew were no longer here anymore. And representation wasn't what it had been. And we had gone backwards. And Cynthia was a part of that group and helping lead us. And at that time, we were all in not the roles that we sit in today. And that group went and approached our sponsors, who were executive sponsors of the Black Professionals Group, and we approached our CEO, Brian Moynihan, by the way, who's 2 years into the job, dealing with the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression. Could be argued that he might have other stuff that he's focused on. And we said, this is important, and we need you to do, and we had a list. And then it became an annual thing, where as we grew, we said, we need to do, and that included bringing all the top black executives across Bank of America together annually for a summit, help us engage with each other, make sure we knew each other, get energized, help inform how we had sponsorship and mentorship programs, right? Well, that leadership led to, if you look at a lot of the folks who were part of that group are in pretty senior roles around the bank today, I think it's because they showed leadership beyond their day job. So I say what energizes you when you think about it is what energizes you for your career. Do you aspire to lead in a bigger and broader role? Do you aspire to continue to advance? I often tell people one of your best opportunities to show leadership is not in your day job. It's what else you do to help lead across your company, whatever company you're at. That's not a Bank of America specific attribute. My experience is that people very often don't get the opportunities in their day job to distinguish themselves, and where they do get to distinguish themselves, it's a special project, it's a special initiative, it's where they've taken the initiative to do something different. So use that maybe as a motivation, energizing in terms of when you're talking to people and say, why? Why should I do more? I'm doing enough already.
The only other thing I will add is we also do, may not be completely public, but we actually reward them at the end of the year financially for those that lead. We also do a D&I Awards every year. We're going to host it again in December. The entire management team and CEO comes. The majority of those that are being recognized are in those networks and are in leadership positions. The last thing that's important is tying those leadership positions to succession planning. It makes people actually want to be a part of it because they view that as a way to reap the benefits that Steve talked about. The last thing I will say is many of the executive sponsors are not aligned to that group. So we want other voices and advocacies to help influence, provide funding, various different support. So there's a multi-pronged strategic approach to try to encourage, which we find people are just joining. Our numbers continue to increase year over year in terms of participation.
Hi, Obi Ibakwe. I am currently with Pfizer. Started a new role about 2 months ago, and starting to create a vision and a strategy for what Pfizer's role can be in terms of health equity, or removing barriers that are contributing to health inequities. So I have two questions for you. The first is really around, it feels like you guys have done a really nice job at Bank of America at identifying what the barriers are, right, that are contributing to inequities and addressing them, even though they may not fall within Bank of America's traditional business line. So I want to get a sense of how you were able to convince the organization that you should be involved in things like food banks, that you should be involved in things like healthcare, and that's contributing to your bottom line. So I find that I'm running into some barriers because we've identified what the barriers are from a health inequities perspective, but the feedback that I'm getting is that that's not within our business, right? So I'd love to get a sense of how you were able to convince the organization to play in these other places that are not within your traditional business. The second question is around metrics. So I think it's great that there's so much energy around equity right now. My concern is it going to be sustainable, right? Is it just something that these corporations are focusing on in the moment? And for me, it's really important that whatever we do and create is sustainable. But the metrics that the organization uses to evaluate success, I think Caroline mentioned this morning, they asked what is the ROI and what it is that you're doing, and the things that we're doing don't necessarily show value in the way that the organization is used to evaluating and assessing value. So can you tell me a little bit about how you convince the organization that what you're doing is impactful to the bottom line in the long term, given that that's not how the organization traditionally thinks about success and thinks about benefit and value?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. And my answer won't be as fulsome as probably the question, to be honest, just to be, because in the interest of time. A couple of things first, I just got to be honest. We didn't have to convince anybody because the person who convinced us was our CEO. So it went the other way. And now let me tell you why, though, because I actually challenged the premise. This isn't at you, it's because this is actually what I hear all the time. I challenge the premise of the question that it's not core to what we need to do as a bank. It's just the way people think about it, and that we don't see the same return. So let me give you an example. At Bank of America, one of the areas we focused on is health and wellness. We self-insure for our entire employee base. So we run wellness and Get Active campaigns every year for our employees who have made under $50,000 a year. I think we're 12 years in now that they haven't seen an increase in health premiums because we understand the importance of them getting preventive health care, and we understand that if the premiums get prohibitive, they won't do it. Between 50 and 100, I think it's only been like 2 or 3% or something like that, so we've kept it down. We've just cascaded that now to, as I mentioned, we have to care about what impacts our clients, what impacts our employees, what impacts our shareholders, and, which is what we talk about under responsible growth, and we have to solve society's greatest challenges because we're just a part of society. And so we actually do believe it's very much in our vested interest for us to solve inequity in health outcomes. We think it's in our best interest to have programs that drive jobs and reskilling, and it doesn't mean they're all going to get hired by Bank of America. We actually think that the healthier our communities that we participate in and serve are, the greater the benefit will be back to us. And then when you kind of talk about the ROI, because I think that that's interesting, and look, I could talk about it in terms of environmental. Some people will say, okay, you guys talk about environmental, why is that important? We said, well, if you have most of the major corporations in the world have agreed to get to net zero, and we don't help our clients figure out how to get there, is there not an existential risk to their ability to do business? Eventually, they're going to be locked out of RFPs and things like that that enable their business to go. Well, so now how do I take that to other topics that might matter to us? We know that there are metrics in terms of how companies are measured in terms of what's the representation on their board, what's the representation in their senior management teams. We know that if we want to grow no excuses, there's a pretty big divide between the home ownership rate between white Americans and black and brown Americans. So the reality is I'm not going to grow and continue to grow share unless I solve a problem that's going on in our community, which is that I know that I've got a significant portion of our community that's in what we call the unbanked. That's not healthy for us. So I want to get them in the bank. So I've got to get solutions that meet their needs. And to me, that is a benefit in ROI, because I think every time I can get the primary checking account of a client, I can help them grow, make their financial lives better, help wealth creation. So now that sounds esoteric, except when you think about it over the long term. And when you think about it over the long term, that's how you're actually going to drive sustainable growth. If we start leaving parts of our community behind, we aren't going to grow sustainably. So that's the way we think about it, I would say, at the bank. And so you might, I'm purposely challenging the premise. Do you really hear this in a quarterly earnings call? You probably don't, right? Because people are talking specifically, what did you do quarter over quarter and year over year? The only way you actually drive that sustainably over time is if you actually have this long view, because eventually you're going to find out that you've left a significant part of your addressable market behind. And our job is to make sure that that doesn't happen, so we drive sustainable growth.
So I started off with two amazing powerhouses. Let's give them a round of applause. Tiffany, I don't know, for those of you who were the last, she said purse, but it's pocketbook. There are a lot of people where, because you don't use the term pocketbook, so if I say I got my pocketbook, that means I need to talk, and these are two people that I call every now and then just to say, hey, I got my pocketbook, that means you need to meet me outside, we need to talk. I just wanted to say, look, the issues around social justice, equity, economic opportunity are real. And we wanted to give you a perspective, an inside view of some of the things that we're doing as a company. It is very important that we just not talk the talk. Institutions have to walk the walk, and you need leaders like Steve and Ebony to drive the way. You do not have to be, however, a Fortune 500 company to make a difference on these topics around equity in the world we live in. So we're hoping you took away a couple of nuggets, maybe for yourself and your organizations, but we need to reflect personally about our individual responsibility and what are we doing to create a more equitable world for all. So for that, I want to thank you for joining us and have an amazing experience for the rest of your ELC journey. Thank you.